Thank you for joining us for today's keynote as part of our day-long symposium. It's nice to see we had some more people that are joining us this evening. My name is Michaela Tai. I'm the director of 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art, and my brain is so full after a day of debates about what it is to be Asian Australian today, what we should be doing, what we should be thinking about, what's next for the organisation. And it's really great to be going away with so many more questions than I arrived with. So it's been a really fantastic day seeing old 4A faces, new 4A faces, and thinking about what we can do over the next 20 years. But I'm very excited about introducing Sara Raza as our keynote speaker today. 4A has a very long history of responding to migrant stories that become Australian stories. And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, that as a country of migrants, we need to respond to every story that's a migrant story because they are very much our shared stories. And as 4A has developed, we've responded initially quite predominantly to Vietnamese, Chinese and Filipino stories because our first members were from that ethnic background and were really envisaging a space that could tell their story, where they envisaged a space where the public could really interact with what they thought of as themselves and what they thought Australia should be. And as time has passed, 4A has pivoted many times, and our latest pivot, as you can probably take, has been quite large. We've got a new website, a new brand and everything that launched today. We've got a new online journal that launched today. We've got every single exhibition that's ever been at 4A now online as of today. So it's been a really big reflective moment for us. And looking towards the future, we're looking towards our new migrant stories, some of which are South Asian, some of which are from the Middle East, some are from Central Asia. These stories may feel at the moment like they're not our stories, but they very much, if they aren't our stories now, they will be our stories tomorrow. So when we thought about who should be our keynote, I wanted someone who could reflect this new thinking, and Sara has been working so diligently for her entire career on voices and working in areas that may seem, I think as Edmund put it the other day when we were talking, like this magical oasis that no one can quite pinpoint on the map. This sort of area of Central Asia, this idea of the Middle East, the idea of North Africa. And through her work, which has been consistent over the last more than a decade, she's given voice and given space and demanded that large institutions like the Guggenheim, where she is now, make space for these kinds of conversations. So she was a really fantastic and very easy choice for us to approach. When we asked her and she said yes straight away, it was even nicer. And on a very personal note, she said to me straight away, "Oh, it's very exciting because Melissa Chu was my mentor when I was at the Asia Society. So it's great that even though it's not really a 4A story, it has its origins that come from here." So some background on Sara. She is currently the UBS map curator of the Middle East, North Africa at the Guggenheim in New York. She's born in London. She earned her BA in English Literature and the History of Art and an MA in Art History and Theory, both from Goldsmiths, the University of London, and she also pursued studies towards her PhD at the Royal College of Art. She's curated exhibitions and projects for several international biennales and festivals, including Tashkent Biennale, Quotations from Daily Life, the Art Gallery of Uzbekistan, Rizoma, i.e. Generation in Waiting, Collateral Event at the Venice Biennale 2013, and Baku Public Art Festival, A Drop of Sky, Irat, Contemporary Art Space, Baku, Azerbaijan. She's also co-curated the Bishkek International In the Shadow Fallen Heroes at the Bishkek Historical Museum and Alto Square in Kyrgyzstan, and she's curated exhibitions further afield in Shanghai, Sharjah, Canada and Dubai. She was formerly the head of education at Contemporary Art Space in Baku and founding head of the curatorial programs at Alan Art Space in Riyadh and Saudi Arabia. She's also been the curator of public programs at the Tate Modern in London. She has infinite experience in this region, which is very rare in the contemporary art world, so we're very excited that she's here to speak with us today. And more than just a curator, she, in reflecting our new sort of pursuits, is also a prolific writer. If you read Art Asia Pacific, the almanac, which comes out every January, which is like the first thing that we read, she's the author of all the sections for the West and Central Asia. She's also the author of Punk Orientalism, Central Asia's Contemporary Art Revolution, which we published next year in 2017 by Black Dog Publishing in London. So if you would join me in welcoming Sara to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, and welcome to the wonderful symposium celebrating 20 years for a Center for Contemporary Asian Art. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all here this evening and to accept the invitation to give you a keynote, a little bit about my practice, which has decisively looked at art practices east of the EU. I am a student from Goldsmiths College, which is the birthplace of the YBAs, and I often say that I kind of rejected that and looked at the eastern side of the border of Europe and really reflected upon critical practices, geographies, visual cultures, and looking at the kind of fluidity of borders and how they shift and change. Today, the subject of my talk is specificity of site. And the subject of site is a very pertinent issue, not just in relationship to location, but also important issues such as migration of people, of ideas. And the taking of, subverting of these ideas is central to my curatorial practice, as well as my written work. I'm also an editor of Art Asia Pacific, and I have been so for 13 years. So often ideas come to me through my writing and through my art historical academic work. I focused very much in my current project at the Guggenheim on Middle East and North Africa. I have a double discipline in which I focus professionally on the Middle East and North Africa, but also look at the post-Soviet space. I have both Persian and Central Asian heritage, which is often reflected within my critical and curatorial work. The subject of migration is pretty much central to my practice, both in terms of labor, economies, but also looking at the shifting dichotomy that we're entering the current moment. As you can tell by my accent, I've spent some time in England. In fact, I was actually born in London, and I have lived, worked there, and also my entire academic career has taken place there. And this summer, Brexit happened. No one really saw that coming this year. Many people had been kind of oblivious that it would never happen, but Europe and United Kingdom broke away. So that has caused a kind of very urgent moment in terms of how we redefine borders in Europe, but also who is permitted to enter Europe and who is not. And also, it has kind of led to a more dangerous moment. In some aspects, it's legitimizing racism. It's legitimizing certain ideas around the other and reshaping some of the more negative rhetoric that existed 20, 30, 40 years ago. And we can't avoid the subject of empire when we look at something like the United Kingdom and Europe. And I wish that they would teach that in universities, because then I guess ordinary people, citizens, would understand why there are migrants living in their country, why there are migrants here in Australia, why there are migrants there in the United Kingdom and Europe, and further afield. And now I'm currently residing in New York, and we're going through another dilemma there. Next week, when I return back to the United States, we're going to have a brand new president, which, as you all know, you've been following the news, following the debates, the whole idea of the wall, this building of this wall that's going to separate or close the border between the United States and Mexico, all these draconian policies about immigration that are affecting migratory footprints, and in essence are being reflected by contemporary artists in visual cultures who are looking at migratory aesthetics. So as I mentioned to you, that I am looking at this subject quite heavily within my curatorial practice as well. And then I'm also looking at the alternative proposals. I don't claim to know the answer necessarily, but I do like to suggest alternative proposals in what could constitute different answers. And something I like to think about, and I know that Michaela also mentioned this, working on the slides, what she said in academia. I'm very much interested in conceptual contraband and how contraband, a very illicit, negative term, we can look for value within that. So the whole idea of smuggling in certain histories, certain ideas, and how we can subvert the kind of dominant discourse, kind of break away from the Euro-American centric discourse. And this is kind of conceptual, if you like, and I think it's something that, as a non-Western academic, non-Western curator, something that I'm grappling with in my own work. How can I create a non-didactic language? How can I create new visual cultural languages or new ways in which we can marry theory with visual culture in a way that we can present new forms and bring value into something that's unrecorded and necessarily isn't visible to the naked eye. And that's quite important within my practice. So my current project, which I just closed, is the Guggenheim project, But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise. I am currently the UBS curator at the museum. And what that is actually a partnership between UBS Bank, the Swiss bank, and the Guggenheim Museum, which started 5 years ago with the intention of diversifying the Guggenheim's holdings in America, which is predominantly Euro-American centric. So it started looking at 3 different diverse geographical areas. So it started with South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, and now Middle East and North Africa. These are multi-year, multi-city projects. In that my project, when it opened in New York, my colleague Pablo Leon de la Barra, his project opened in London. Prior to that, it toured to Mexico City. And so it's a very exciting project. It kind of marries curatorial scholarship with acquisitions. So it allows curators like myself to bring their own ideas, fluid ideas, as well as looking at a collection such as the Guggenheim. So I was able to kind of really study this collection, look at some of the elements and components that resided within it, but really bring my own ideas forth. And it was a challenge. First of all, I said, what have I done by accepting this? This is such, in the 21st century, I should not be curating a show about geography, about a geographically prescribed region. Haven't we evolved from there? So it became a mandate for me to look at an ideas-driven narrative, not to look at a geographically specific. Especially when we think about the Middle East and North Africa, it is entirely a construct, the way Latin America is, the way parts of Asia are. With the exception of Iran and Turkey, the entire region has undergone some form of colonial physical occupation. I mean, not to say that Iran and Turkey have never been colonized, they have been, but more conceptually. And if we think about what happened in the 20th century under the Pahlavi regime in Iran and also in Turkey under Ataturk, there were many ideas around Western ideals of modernism. And modernism, the other side of that is obviously colonialism, and that takes many forms. So it's important to kind of think about. And the Middle East is a part of the world that kind of runs around the middle belt of the globe. So it's cut between West Asia and North Africa. So politically, in terms of it falling in 2 geographical remits, Africa and West Asia. So when we were speaking earlier on about other Asias, there are already these ideas about overlapping. And if we think about Turkey as an example, it resides both in Europe and in Asia. So that's also very interesting to consider. In terms of the project, I was very much interested in, firstly, bringing this thematic idea. And if we think about the title of this show, But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise, I'm just going to flick through some photographs so you can just see some ideas, and we'll meditate on a few of them. I'm not going to go through every single artwork. The title of the show, some of you may recognize, But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise, comes from the German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin, who perished during the Second World War. He was an important philosopher, part of the Frankfurt School, and he had written a very important essay, Thesis on Philosophy, which is his last written work. And he, like many other intellectuals, was trying to flee Nazi persecution of France, where he resided. So he was trying to go through Spain, France and Spain, through the Pyrenees Mountains to make it onto neutral Portugal, where there he would then go on to the United States of America. Unfortunately, when he arrived in Portugal, he was told that his visa would be revoked. He subsequently committed suicide. And which was, a very traumatic moment. And if we think about the kind of migratory footprint of the Second World War, at the current moment, the Syrian crisis is the largest migratory footprint in Europe since Second World War. So that's an atrocity that happened less than 100 years ago. So these kind of draconian policies is almost being mirrored again, this almost kind of repetition of history. So I was looking at really a group of artists. I was able to acquire 26 artworks by 20 artists from the Middle East and North Africa, including its international diaspora. Ironically, half of my artists don't reside in what constitutes as the Middle East. They are holding studios in multiple cities, they hold multiple passports, they've studied in one country, they live in another, yet they identify with the places and spaces of how we understand what is the Middle East. And if we think about space, it's not just a physical thing, it's also a mental question as well. And that, resides within the colonial imagination as well, in the way in which the region, in a more crude term, was literally carved up between Britain and Europe. So many of these artists have found themselves in different parts of the world, so it's important to kind of reflect upon the contemporary practices. Several artists, regardless of being Middle Eastern or Asian or so forth, have this kind of living. This is part of the contemporary kind of process of becoming. And if we think about the idea of what migration is, it's a very fluid idea. It's an idea rooted in the now. It's not stagnant. It's very elastic and it's very pliable. So although the artists are all contemporary that are in my show, they all do not disown the past. They're very much connected to the past. I often think of like the whole idea of abandoning the past as a very nihilist Western idea, how the past is almost removed from us. So it's very important to kind of maintain that idea, especially when we're thinking of ideas around origins. So my main central theme for the exhibition was actually geometries, but not geometries in its like physical sense, but more conceptual as a branch of the thinking sciences, as a branch of mathematics, and how that relates to ideas around logic, thinking as well, and some cases truth. Some of you may know the writing of Edmund, who was a very important phenomenologist and mathematician, writing at a moment in crisis in Europe. He was writing in 1939. He published a text called Crisis in Modern Sciences, in which he argued that we had to go back to return inquiry. We have to look at what the Islamic polymaths from the 7th and 13th century were doing, how they were closer to this idea of truth. So I often like to think of my exhibition as 18 avenues into what constitutes as the real. Proposals, not necessarily definitive answers, but artists who provide us with an alternative view, a view that is very far from this media view that we see of this region. That, may I have some water, please? That we see populated in the global media today. So that was quite important to kind of look at that. But also within geometries resides the idea of origins, and this is a very complex idea if we think about the Middle East as well, how it's been divided. Thank you so much. Excuse me. So moving on from the ideas of geometries, I was very much interested in the ideologies of architecture. Architects were really seen as the kind of makers of the modern Middle East. I often give Iran as an example in Turkey because architects had played a very central role there. They were often involved in very important projects, thank you very much, in projects that enabled them to kind of participate as architects of a nation. So they were taking part in many projects in which the countries, as they were heading towards modernism, were really kind of moving away from religion, kind of the idea, and moving more towards secularism. So many tombs had undergone, like sites, had undergone major renovation. Ataturk himself invited Adolf Loos, an Austrian architect, to come and transform the Ankara, which is the capital of Turkey. And often artists cite that Ankara was a very fascist kind of Austrian city in terms of its a facade and structure. So it's quite interesting to look at that. But at the same time, there was also the colonial enterprise. So many cities had undergone a colonial treatment. On the top left-hand side, we see the work of Kader Attia. And Kader Attia, you'll all be in for a treat because this work is actually going to be the MCA. He's having a retrospective here next year in April, and the Guggenheim will be loaning the molds for Untitled Gardea. And Gardea is a city in Algeria, in southern Algeria, and that was frequently visited by Western architects. Algeria was under the French in the 19th century, and Western star architect Le Corbusier had frequented Algeria on several occasions, along with his successor, Fernand Poulen. Unfortunately, for some reason, Le Corbusier never really acknowledged how much Algeria was part of his imagination, his architectural work. In particular, during his moment in Algeria, he made many unsolicited proposals, none of which were ever realized. However, he went back to France and built social housing on many of the ideas that he had acquired. So the artist here has taken the concept of Gardea and reincarnated the city entirely in couscous. And couscous is a Mediterranean staple food of the entire Mediterranean. It's a very common dish. So we like to think of this as a kind of posthumous dinner invitation to Le Corbusier and his successor. And often when an architect, I have a few friends who are architects and some relatives as well, I shouldn't really say this, but they often are very good cooks. Those are the bad ones, actually, that they're actually very good cooks. Those that can't cook in architecture, so that's quite interesting. And on the top right, it was really important, as I mentioned to you, to kind of move away from politicized readings of the Middle East. We're seeing too much of that in the news as it is. I wanted to kind of use other metaphorical languages, so the issue of plant life became quite apparent. On the top right, you see the work of Abbas Akavan, Study for a Monument. These are a series of plants that were native to the Euphrates Tigris river system from ancient Mesopotamia, roughly coincidental with contemporary day Iraq. And these plants he was able to source from Kew Gardens in England, and he cast them in bronze. He exaggerated their scale. They became human-centric, resembling vertebrae, arms, limbs. But the way in which they are displayed presents several readings that allude to several political struggles. One could be a way in which bodies, after a funeral, like a genocide, have been displayed. Often within the Islamic faith, the bodies are wrapped in the shroud. Also in Judaism, another could be illicit finds when they're interrupted. If we think about enterprises such as ISIS, they are fueled by the illicit sale of oil and antiquities. So that's also a reminder of that. But also in medieval Iran, bronze was a material for weaponry. It was also in the Ottoman period as well, for cannons and armor as well. So there is that resonance there. But it was really important to kind of look at this, and several readings obviously are alluding to environmental disaster. Saddam Hussein himself did actually pollute the marshes where these plants were native and growing. So there is that kind of language going on here as well. Another important point that I want to focus on is at the bottom right, you see Mariam Ghani, A Brief History of Collapses. Mariam Ghani is an Afghan Lebanese artist. She was actually born in the United States. She also happens to be the daughter of Ashraf Ghani, who's the current president of Afghanistan. And she's been exploring the kind of dichotomy of Afghanistan as a country akin to Iran, akin to Turkey, that had a very Western-facing ideal. But some of you may ask me, what's Afghanistan doing in a show about the Middle East and North Africa? Well, interesting enough, in the 20th century, Afghanistan played a huge role during the Cold War era. In particular, the Mujahideen, who were fighting against the Soviets, were supported by the United States and also supported by other Western entities. And then, ironically, that role reprised itself after 9/11, but almost reversed itself. And for me, it was really important to kind of look at the attack on architecture as an attack on civil society. I was very aware when curating the show and bringing in this collection in America, in New York in particular, there were some sensitive histories, in particular pertaining to 9/11, and kind of increase in Islamophobia, which seems to be kind of pandemic, if you like. It's not just exclusive anymore to the United States. It seems to be happening everywhere. So it was very important to kind of look at 9/11 as an example, but not necessarily speak about it. So I chose to kind of look at Afghanistan and its kind of destruction and how it was kind of left. And in A Brief History of Collapses, which is a work that I first saw in Documenta in 2013, is a piece that juxtaposes a former palace in Kabul in Afghanistan, which has been left decapitated after a war, along with a building in Kassel, Germany, that was restored after the Second World War as a site for documentary for the dissemination and display of art. And it was restored, it was very fine in its appearance, whereas the palace in Kabul resides in tatters. And it was very interesting to kind of look at that, because both the buildings were built in the German neoclassical style. Shah Amanullah, who was the king of Afghanistan at the time, in the early 20th century, commissioned German architect to make his palace. So there are all these ideas about architecture being used as an ideological tool. Often when we think about what's happening in the world, what's happening in Syria right now, what's happening in Iraq, all these important sites and artifacts have been destroyed. I often think about the Buddhas of Bamia as an example as well, as a kind of attack. And I often cite, like 9/11 as well, the destruction of the towers. It was an attack on civil society. Two of the people that orchestrated that, one had an architecture background, the other one had a structural engineering background. So they knew where to hit this building in order to destroy it. So it's quite interesting to kind of look at architecture in such a way and how it is used and abused, rather than, because it kind of cripples a society of sorts, particularly when their heritage is attacked. And coming back, I'd like to mediate on these two works that are quite pertinent to the Guggenheim. When I was building this collection, it was really important for me to consider a collection that then the American curators at Guggenheim would be able to work with. It was very important that it wasn't an alien collection, that it wasn't just about formal relations. There was something more embedded within that. There was a contemporary story. And the Guggenheim's collection was founded on three principles: art of our time, art of abstraction and non-objective painting. So when Peggy Guggenheim was collecting, before that Solomon R. Guggenheim or Hilla Ribe were collecting on behalf of the institution, that was the core mandate that they were looking at. So it was very important for me to kind of marry that within my work as well, but to also think about sight, how the Guggenheim becomes a protagonist in all of this, how Frank Lloyd Wright, who's the architect of the Guggenheim, became a kind of figure, if you like, within the story. But before we get to that, I'd like to talk about this work that resides, which is suspended from the ceiling. It is a stainless steel flying carpet, and it wouldn't be a show about the Middle East if we didn't have one Orientalist cliche in there. And the flying carpets and this whole idea, about the Orient. If we think about the study of Orientalism, what Edward Said defined, it was how the West imagined or perceived the Orient. And I'm grappling with that too, because sometimes maybe I'm accusing myself of doing a bit of Eastern Orientalism, and I think that we were touching upon that in a different way in today's symposium as well. And so the whole idea was that when flying carpets became more popular, when it was translated, when the 1001 Nights was translated in the 1800s, 19th century, into English, French, and other Latin languages, how it populated the imagination, the Middle East became this kind of very exotic place. At once it was dirty, at once it was dangerous, at once it was alluring. So it had all these kind of dichotomies and juxtapositions placed around it. And Venice was a very important kind of protagonist within the story as well. Some of you may have read, obviously, Merchant of Venice, Othello, to look at the position of traders, and particularly when we redefine what is the contemporary Silk Road, or what was historically the Silk Road's route, and in particular the trading of ideas, people, cultures, and politics. So the piece Flying Carpets was actually articulated by artist Nadia Kabilinki, who is a half Tunisian, half Ukrainian artist who grew up in Sharjah, studied in France, and now lives in Berlin, Germany. So that's another kind of interesting migratory pattern there and then. She spent 8 days studying street hawkers in Venice, these men from North Africa, Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, who sell their wares to tourists on these carpet-like mats. She measured their mats. She measured the steps that they take on the bridge, central bridges. In particular, the bridge became an alternative mode of transportation by foot. Many of these young men who have come to Europe have come in search of prosperity, illegal immigrants. Sadly, they don't have any means to, enter society on any legal terms. They come to Europe in search of prosperity. They end up becoming part of the black market. They become part of the black market economy because they're never given the position. They're almost like a silent majority. So she measured their steps, she measured the steps of the bridge, and she created this fantastical geometric sculpture. And it's stainless steel, hand with rubber threads. Very beautiful description of this work was by Holland Cotter. He's the New York Times critic. He called it a punishing rain of needles, because when you stand underneath this beautiful sculpture, it looks like you're standing in an open-air prison, which does articulate the reality of several of these people who have come to Europe. And Venice was so important historically during the medieval period and much later as well. Salt was the main kind of commodity that was traded. It was such sought after as just the way oil is today. It was kind of interesting to kind of bring that story back to Europe and kind of think about these migratory footprints that are occurring right now in our contemporary age, and how those that we often overlook are suffering the most treacherous times. So it's very important to kind of reflect upon that. And underneath Nadia's carpet, one point going back to Nadia, I'd like to articulate is that the Arab Spring, which started in 2010, actually started from Tunisia. It started when this young man who was 23 years old had his wares confiscated by a bureaucrat. And when that happened, he self-immolated. He died from his injuries, but it caused this domino effect. It caused this effect all over the Arab world. And that's something very interesting when we think about what's happening in the world, how these kind of neo-colonial enterprises are emerging, how it's affecting disparity of wealth as well. And so why so many people are desperate to come to Europe. And many of these people actually drown, along the Mediterranean Sea. And the irony is, in Malta, for example, in Europe, it is forbidden, it is actually illegal for fishermen to actually rescue somebody whose boat has capsized, a citizen. So if you think about if you're eating fish from the Mediterranean Sea, you're actually part of your own food chain. in an ironic way as well. So there are much more sinister ideas as well if we think about migration. And underneath is the work by Ala Yunus, and it's entitled Plan for Greater Baghdad. And this really brings everything back to the Guggenheim and creates a kind of transnational journey. Frank Lloyd Wright, who is the architect of the Solomon R. Guggenheim, was invited to Iraq in the 1950s, to Baghdad, along with Gropius and with Le Corbusier, and Gropius being the kind of founder of the Bauhaus movement as well. And when they were all invited, they were all there to kind of modernize Iraq, create a kind of secular idea. And Frank Lloyd Wright entitled a Plan for Greater Baghdad, which would house an opera theater, a university, and a cultural complex, a gymnasium. And he was invited under the invitation of a very forward-thinking monarch, King Faisal, who was a British-appointed monarch. At that time, Iraq was a British mandate. And when he was invited, he put forward this plan, but the monarchy of King Faisal was very short-lived. It collapsed not long after. And therefore, at the end of that, the plans also collapsed. Then Le Corbusier came back, and he took Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas and submitted a plan for a gymnasium. And it didn't go well either. 25 years passed. Saddam Hussein then came into power and released an architect called Rifat Chaudhry, who was very close to those plans, who happened to be in prison at that time, to build this gymnasium. And it was inaugurated in the mid-80s in 85 and became known as Saddam Hussein Gymnasium. So what you see here are models. Sorry, it's not a great picture of all the different protagonists who took part in the making of this gymnasium, and two timelines. One is for the making of the gymnasium. The other is for the 25-year period of history in Baghdad, the kind of turbulence, the 6 changes of states of head, the numerous military coups, as well as other turbulent affairs, and obviously Saddam Hussein coming to power, which is quite significant. And it's really important to kind of point out that Saddam Hussein, like many rulers in the Arab world, was not an Islamicist. He was a very secular person. If we think about what the gymnasium connotates, it's all about this healthy city, healthy mind. And that also happened in Israel as well, and also in the former Soviet Union. There was a strong idea around recreation and athleticism. Another aspect of the project for me, when I think about geometries, I also think about the body and how the body relates. If we often think about Le Corbusier's modular, it's a great example of how the body enacts architecture, or ideas around the golden section that's, perhaps in Western culture, more commonly known in the work of Da Vinci, and obviously several painters as well that look for that kind of center point. Ideas that have emerged from the Islamic world. But it was also interesting for me to kind of bring in other narratives, and performance became a way in which I could punctuate the exhibition, but also the Guggenheim. How can we critically look at an institution like the Guggenheim? And so I invited an Israeli performance group called Public Movement to come and be in resident during my exhibition. And they crafted a performance called Choreographies of Power. And they took a central year of 1967. 1967 was the Israeli war, in which, obviously against Lebanon, 6-day Israeli war was very much populated. But they looked at that year in collaboration with what was happening at the Guggenheim and its history. So in essence, they kind of went through the dirty laundry of the Guggenheim. So I nearly got into trouble for this, but it's, in the name of art, so I kind of got away with it a little bit. And then there were a lot of back and forth. So Choreographies of Power, the artists really started looking at paintings as protagonists within the question of what is a nation state, the building of modernism and nation states, which is a kind of new concept. And Israel being a very interesting example, a kind of, some cases, violent occupation of one ideology atop of another, and the way in which paintings kind of functioned within that. And they were invited, and they spent time really studying the space of the Guggenheim, but also looking at 2 key moments in the history of. One was, for example, the theft of a Chagall that happened at the Guggenheim in the 60s, but it was never reported. It wasn't reported because Interpol had advised the Guggenheim not to do so, because it would put the painting further underground. It would push it further underground. It would never resurface. But one day it did resurface, but it took 20 years or so for the case to be resolved, and then the Guggenheim won the case. But it wasn't based on secrecy. It was kind of the idea that they, have an autonomy to disclose to the public what they wish. And so they subverted this idea. They kind of looked at the idea of secrecy, smuggling, and the other idea was that they asked us to bring out from our storage a painting, another painting by Matisse that looked at these dancers, and it was very interesting because the painting was damaged in a fire at the Guggenheim, yet that was never really publicly disclosed. It was in all the press at the time, it was in our archives, but it was something that wasn't really spoken about. And slight scratch had happened to the painting during this fire with a shard of glass cut it, and they kind of reenacted performance around this. So there was some unpleasant feeling, but mostly quite interesting because we were critically looking at the role of institutions, the role of the making of modern art, but also how we can critically reevaluate that through paintings as envoys. And we're having this Israeli group there also created a kind of new dynamic as well. And there were moments of violence within this performance. There were also very moments of beauty as well, in which they also hung an artwork within my show, which was a painting by Urs Lesser that inaugurated the State of Israel in 1948. So it's kind of interesting history there. So this region, I approached it like this complex jigsaw puzzle, this fragmented, complex jigsaw that somehow comes together. Some of the parts are jagged, some of the parts are smooth, but somehow it comes. And to look at it with all these different ideological resonances. And if we think about 1948, it's not just referring to the State of Israel. 1 year prior, India underwent its partition, and then obviously there was the Cold War rhetoric after that as well, and how half of Asia was behind an Iron Curtain, which brings me to kind of crisscross my interests across geographies as well. And as Michaela mentioned, I've been working academically and over the last 10 years in Caucasus as well, in Central Asia. And it's often part of my work that I look at kind of monumental culture, shifts in architecture and public space. It's very important to my practice. And I'm going to cite a few examples from recent festival that I curated for Yarat, which is in Baku in Azerbaijan, entitled A Drop of Sky. And when I was thinking about this project, it was very interesting because Azerbaijan is a country that has got tremendous oil wealth. It borders Iran, it's on the Caspian as well, but it was also part of the former Soviet Union. And for 75 years, it was under the Soviets. And then obviously it gained its independence along with other republics in that year of 91. And if we think about just a bit prior, 1989 was when the Berlin Wall fell, the Cultural Revolution came to the end. So there are all these kind of resonances, this kind of transnational history. So it's not just exclusive to one. So it's kind of important to look at Baku as an alternative hub, and in particular, the kind of architectural ideologies that are shifting there. Baku was a very important city in medieval times. It was also cited a lot in the Shahnameh and many other historical literature of Iran as well, and it was a major port that connected Asia and Europe. And it has been featured a lot in literature, historical literature. So the project that I was working on was entitled A Drop of Sky, and it ran through the summer, and I was able to bring international and local artists together, but also to look upon the writing and ideas of a 14th century Islamic polymath, a Persian-Turkic polymath called Nasser al-Din al-Tusi, and also compare his work with a kind of Russian futurist poet, Valmir Khlebnikov. And that was really the kind of central idea, because there are ideas around futurisms that I wanted to explore, and particularly in a city that, or a country that has gone through this fast-track globalization due to tremendous oil wealth, where there isn't this smooth transition like we see in the West, where, you know, modernism ended, we're in postmodernism, we're in the contemporary period, it somehow fast-tracked itself. So there are several artists that I was exploring, one of which was Ergin Çavuşoğlu, who is a Turkish artist who was born in Bulgaria and left in the 90s, and his family were forcibly asked to move back to Turkey under kind of forced assimilation plan that was happening in the former Yugoslavia. And he's very much also interested in the kind of language of blueprint, which is the first step or design in a drawing or any industrial drawing or architecture as well. And he designed the work Liquid Breeding, which is based upon Duchamp and Man Ray's large glass with dust motes, and which resides within the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And what that is a a photograph of Man Ray's that had collected dust over a year, and Duchamp intentionally affixed the dust. And it created the kind of alternative mapping, if you like. And liquid breeding takes two ideas, the concept of dust breeding, which was enacted in Duchamp's work, and also what is happening in terms of oil, water as well. And this is actually a drawing of a cement factory on the outskirts of Istanbul called Noah. And if we think about what Noah signifies as Noah's Ark, the first kind of migratory vessel that ever existed, if you believe that, a little bit of fable there. And so that is also incorporated within the drawing. And this is an anamorphic drawing, so depending on where you're standing, it becomes three-dimensional. And often how the artist works is that he pinpoints the camera at a particular angle, then relays the image in another site, sometimes the internet, or it could also be an adjacent building. So public becomes implicated within this story. This is a very interesting idea of how we see ourselves within architecture, because what has happened in Baku is architecture is so advanced there. Zaha Hadid has designed buildings there, Norman Foster has designed buildings there, that somehow it doesn't really resonate with the local people, which is quite interesting. And also another artist that was grappling with this idea was Nazreen Mammadova, who's a young artist from Azerbaijan, living and working in Baku. And we wanted to kind of push the boundaries of what constitutes as public. We're living in a technological age. So we decided to kind of work together to make a video game called Ouroboros. And those that you might know, Ouroboros is the ancient snake, ancient Chinese symbol for a snake, a tail-biting snake that constantly is going through a process of renewal. Like snakes shed their skin, it kind of bites its own self. So Ouroboros takes its title and is a video game that takes many geometric tropes, but also looks at traditional Azerbaijani tropes and also employed traditional folk music from Azerbaijan. It's downloadable for free on iTunes, and how it works is that when the players are playing, that they must, to increase to the next level, must build the city. Some of you may know Monument Valley, which is a really popular video game. It kind of functions on the same parameter, but it was grappling with some of these physical changes within the public space. And for a long period, it was the best-selling, like best game, #1 game as well, downloadable. So please do have a look if you get the chance. It's actually free to do so. Another project that I wanted to initiate during this festival was with the Architecture Association in London, and a colleague of mine who has worked to initiate several architectural schools internationally in Dubai, in Tehran, in Muscat, and now in Baku. We inaugurated the first ever AA architecture school in Azerbaijan. It kind of really started looking at liquid futures. Again, that whole idea of liquid, water being very important, fluid. It's very malleable as well. So there was that idea here, and it really started looking at indigenous or vernacular architectural tropes that reside within Azerbaijan, and a workshop took place. They were very much looking at the oil wells, which are the original cash machines in the UAE and the Caucasus as well. So it was a really interesting kind of workshop, and allowing not just architects, but also curators, artists, and thinkers to also participate within this, to kind of redefine what constitutes as public and public space, using architecture as a language. And other interventions were to bring in certain elements within the public space. And here is a poem, Green Grass in the Sky Turned Blue, from the Azari language translated, and having that kind of intervention within a very, let's say, traditional society, a society which is not familiar with contemporary art. Contemporary art in Azerbaijan is 10 years old. It's very new, 10, maybe 15 years at most. Very new story. So it was important to kind of push some of those boundaries as well. Under the Soviets, there was a very strong tradition of painting and craft, but obviously it was very stagnant as well, and many contemporary artists are fighting against that at the moment. Another project I want to talk about, now I'm moving across, back to Venice actually, incidentally, is the alternative Saudi Arabian pavilion that I curated in 2013 entitled Rhizoma. Rhizoma is the Greek word for a plant that shoots roots both vertically and horizontally. It was quite interesting to look at Saudi. And I have actually lived there before, and I was spending a lot of time there about 6-7 years ago looking at the contemporary art scene. It's ironic, Saudi Arabia has the largest YouTube subscribers and Twitter subscribers in the world. I was looking at a very new generation that 70% is under the age of 30, but it's a kind of generation in waiting, if you like. And I was very much interested in how astute they were, how they were tweeting, how they were blogging. And it was just fascinated by this part of the world, which many people believe exists underneath a veil, to see how advanced they were. And I was really wanting to work with this generation. So that year in 2013 was not the official pavilion, or there was no pavilion of Saudi Arabia, but I was asked to curate this. Prior to that, in 2011, was the first one, but for some reason the Saudi government didn't allow one in 2013, but they gave the approval for me to curate this one. And it kind of looked at the resurgence of many ideas. I had 22 artists in this project, and they were all under the age of 25, so very young. Some were actually even studying. So these are some of the examples. And ironically, this used to be a salt warehouse as well. So that's kind of interesting, given the fact that a huge proportion of the world's oil comes from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia being such a powerful country, they could actually switch us off if they wanted as well. But at the top, you see many kind of different exhibition views. There's no film industry. There are no cinemas in Saudi Arabia, but there is something else. Young artists are using YouTube as an alternative visual cultural medium, and that became very interesting for me, so I included that in the exhibition. I looked at alternative cinemas. There are two groups. There's Cinema of Arabia and Telfaz 11, and Telfaz in Arabic means television. Sure, thank you. So it's very interesting to kind of bring these ideas into play. And also, something that is happening in Saudi Arabia at the moment is a huge architectural gentrification, particularly in the holy city of Mecca, which is undergoing vast transformation in terms of a kind of commercialization. Obviously, who are we to judge? The Saudi Arabian government claims it's doing it for the good of the pilgrims. Some things are a bit strange about that. There are huge clock towers emerging, Rolex, 5,000 night penthouse suites emerging. So it's quite interesting that artists are looking at that as well. And Mecca is the center of Islam. It is, the concept of origins resides there. Initially, what it houses is a sacred Kaaba. It used to be Jerusalem was the center and the kind of idea of origin, but it shifted to Mecca, which was in Hijaz. This whole region used to be under the Ottomans. It's important to point out that the entire Arab world was under the Ottomans until Britain and Europe bankrupted it, similar to the way in which sanctions are placed in the 20th and 21st century on countries to kind of make them dependent. So when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Arabs were promised by Great Britain and Europe greater autonomy, and then they underwent this process where they're eroding all Ottoman heritage and sites. So it's quite interesting to kind of explore that here within lenticular photography using the work of Ahmed Angawi, but also Ahmed Matter, who is the most prolific Saudi Arabian contemporary artist today. And then also this resurgence of craft. And I was having a good conversation with Hamida, who is a colleague of 4A, about Islamic craft and this kind of resurgence or return to ideas around that a lot of contemporary artists are playing with these tropes. So I also included that within the project. I know that we're super short of time, so I'm going to close on my last project so that we get enough time to have a good discussion. Another thing is, how can we look at ideas around, let's say, Islam or Islamic history within the contemporary moment? Often when I look at this, I don't look at it from a nostalgic perspective, but I'm very much interested in ideas around sciences. As you've kind of noticed, it's a recurring theme. It's either in design, architecture, or mathematics. I was invited to curate a show for Sharjah being awarded the Cultural Capital of Islam in 2013. And I worked with Iraqi NYU professor Wafa Bilal. Some of you may know Wafa because he made the news when he implanted a camera on the back of his head in 2010 as a kind of post-migratory response to having left Iraq during turbulent circumstances and not having any photographs or any memory. So if we think about photography, it's a very dominant process. It's all to do with the hand-eye coordination as we take a picture. But if you have it from the past, it's all the whole idea that you reverse that, you kind of subject yourself to that. And so he implanted this camera that would then feed an image every minute to a server. This is before Instagram existed as well, mind you. So he was quite forward-thinking. But then when I met him for the first time, I said, where did this idea come from? What is about this? What are you doing? He said, did you know the camera was invented in the Islamic world? The pinhole camera, Ibn Haytham, 13th century Islamic scholar from ancient Mesopotamia, invented the pinhole camera. He invented it in such a way that he was imprisoned by under the court of Caliph of Egypt at that time, and he needed to have access to the outside world, so he created this pinhole. And we all know how pinhole cameras work, that they reflect the image. Much in the way that I process the image is always upside down. So we created the first ever camera obscura sculpture in the Middle East, working with architects from the Royal College of Art, where I'm doing my PhD, also with Wafa and his colleagues as well. And how this worked is there were 15 irises that were on a 35-minute loop that allowed for audiences to get used to the light and then the darkness, and then the images were all reversed. So it was a kind of commentary on this fast-track globalization, which I mentioned earlier on, but also looking at ideas around cities on the move. Cities like Sharjah, cities like Dubai that are going through tremendous transformation. And we were trying to kind of look at that with this process of slowing down, which rarely, if you're living in these fast-paced cities, you're allowed to do so. But in this case, you were kind of forced to be within that circumstance. So this was quite an important project for us, to kind of ideas about shifting and slowing down, but also to kind of look at concepts around Islam, or to look at Islamic thinking or science in a kind of non-didactic way, to look at it from not necessarily a nostalgic perspective, but to kind of examine it or re-examine it in the way we use this within our kind of 21st century living, how architecture plays such an important role, how imaging technology plays such an important role within our contemporary condition, and how visual cultural artists are reassessing that. And on that note, I will end it, although I have a longer presentation. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sara, for such an awesome, very fast whip around of what's going on in an area which I think most of us don't really have that much of a grip on. So it's really great to hear it very fast. But if you want to take a seat, I will ask Mr. Edmund Capon, who really needs no introduction. He is our chair of our board. He goes about all tasks with utmost zeal. I expect this one will also be the same. So welcome them both to the stage. Thank you very much.
So what are we going to do? Use these?
Yes, please.
Okay. Do they work?
Hello.
Is that working? No. Let's switch it on. Is yours working?
I think so, yes.
Is this working?
No, you have to switch it on from here.
You see, technology, which you understand. Well, firstly, welcome, thank you. It's fantastic. It's really, really interesting. You know, I've always wanted to go to Baku. Seriously, I see those images of all those wonderful, rather exotic and indulgent houses that were built in the late 19th and early 20th century. Then, of course, it's completely forgotten. And now, when you see images of Baku now, you alluded to them, these amazing buildings sort of twisting up into these great glass oil palaces, I presume.
Flame towers.
I'm sure it's an absolute haven of corruption.
Well,
don't answer that. But the fascinating thing is, I think I can speak for most of us here, that when I say that you're travelling and journeying through territory, geographic and cultural territory, that is probably fairly unfamiliar to most of us. You know, when we think of the Middle East, the image of the Middle East, the middle of the stans, Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, etc., is not exactly one that's conditioned by the modern cultural world or more contemporary art. So it's for us, it's a journey that I think is, for the most part, unfamiliar. But can I go back and start with the show at the Guggenheim? Because most of the artists that you had in the show, how many did you have?
On view, there were 17 artists,
Yeah.
18 artworks.
Yeah, and most of those artists would have travelled across a number of borders, territories, and you alluded to one particular artist who did the beautiful, carpets and hanging curtains, who was at their third destination in Germany. How does that, what sort of baggage do they take with them? This is very pertinent to us at 4A, because this is really, part of our story as well. where do their sort of original sensibilities lie? Do they take them with them, these artists? It's fascinating for me to see artists from various parts of Asia here, how they tenaciously, inevitably hang on to some things. Is that what you found with?
Well, I found this in most artists, the artists who are living and working in both two lands, if you like. Maybe some of them are born one place, they've studied in another, but I think that it adds to the kind of artistic experience, and I haven't seen this as a negative in any way. I've actually seen it as a positive. Anybody who can speak more than one language, who has lived in other worlds, is always at a privileged position in my respect, in my understanding. And with half of my artists, ironically, they were from the international diaspora. They were not living in the Middle East. They identified with the spaces and places with that what constitutes the Middle East, but they were not living there. So that was quite interesting to kind of look at. But there are new definitions constantly when we look at kind of citizen paradox, if you like. And many of these artists, it's a choice for them. They go back and forth. So it's a decisive decision. Some have had to leave, others choose.
Yes, I was going to ask about that. Most of those artists, the 17 you dealt with, they'd all moved, firstly. And secondly, was it a forced movement or a selective one?
Well, in some cases, one of the works I couldn't show was by Emily Jassier. For example, Emily was the only Hugo Boss Prize winner who hadn't been acquired up until now. We couldn't show her in New York because of spatial restrictions and a later acquisition. But for example, for her, being a Palestinian origin, but having an American passport, so the passport becomes an interesting concept. It becomes like a sliding signifier.
One of the other things that in 2012, I think you did, and you mentioned it just now, in Saudi Arabia.
2013, yes.
13, yeah. How did you manage to get on in there? Because I have to say that our image of Saudi Arabia is not that it is corrupt, but it is a corrupting society.
It is obviously a society that runs under a monarchic rule, under the Saud. But it's a very young country. It's only 100 years old. It's a very old historical land, but the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is very young, 100 years. It's hardly, even if we think about other countries, I think Australia is obviously, even since it's founded by the Western colonial, it's a little older. But in terms of Saudi Arabia, I went back in 2011 to help build an art space called Alan, which I was going to speak about. Maybe I will share my presentation with the foray so they can make it available. And I started seeing, obviously, two sides to society. A society where women were the most astute. They had a kind of critical and intellectual edge over their male counterparts. A lot of them were studying fine arts as well. Many of them were privileged, so they were able to study abroad, but then wanted to come back to Saudi Arabia. It was quite important. And working for Al Saderi.
You say they studied abroad but wanted to go back.
Well, their families were there, so they didn't want to obviously part with their families, so it was important to them to keep a link. But Saudi Arabia is a country of contradictions, no more or less than the United States, where I currently reside. But of course, art is a very interesting language, and I think the Saudi government is supporting that now. They obviously see that it's an important tool, especially for having such a young population. 70% is under the age of 30. So it's very interesting. And your question reminds me of something. A few years ago, Steve Jobs came to Saudi Arabia at a TEDx conference, and somebody in the audience asked him, "Do you think our country could ever be like yours? Could we ever be like you?" And he replied, "You have this young population, you have all the tools at your disposal." And he was also fascinated with the whole social media and so forth. And he said that it's only until your generation stands up and does something about it.
Yeah, but that's fine. That's about access to information and the sort of fluidity of information. What I'm interested in about Saudi Arabia is what are the imaginations there? What are the creative juices doing? And what sort of art did you find there?
Well, obviously there are a lot of architects there as well. A lot of people have studied architecture. And
who can cook?
Some aren't so great. That means they're good architects, right? And then, but in terms of architecture or the erosion of architecture, a lot of intellectual thinkers as well, there is a lot of suppression there, of course.
Yeah.
Censorship is a huge issue. And that is not exclusive in any means to Saudi Arabia. That is an epidemic of sorts. Yeah. And however, in some cases it's more extreme. My colleague who curated that project with me, Ashraf Fayyad, you may have heard that he was imprisoned 2 years ago because he wrote a series of poems that were deemed blasphemous by the Saudi Arabian government. So there are languages, but there is another kind of, people aren't making nudity for the sake of it. They aren't trying to upset the government for the sake of it. So there are new languages, coded languages that artists are deciphering. They're using, for example, I mentioned YouTube as an alternative cultural medium. They're looking at architecture, they're re-investigating design, Islamic design, ideas around geometries, ideas around traditional craft, and reviving that. There's a huge kind of influx of artists ironically studying in London at the Prince's School of Islamic Art and rediscovering Islamic art, looking at some of the visual cultural tropes that reside within that and articulating that within their practice. And that seems to be something, and it's fast-paced. It's also grassroots. It's artist-led, it's peer-driven. They don't have the infrastructure like, for example, the UAE does, or Iran does, or Turkey does, or even Israel in the region. They don't have that sophisticated infrastructure. But what they do have is a strong peer-led community.
Yeah, but what they don't have, but you've said everything that, which I understand, but what seems to me to be missing in that is the kind of intellectual emotive content. I mean, what you've been talking about, and it's one of the things that really intrigues me about what's happening in the contemporary art in the Islamic world, where it seems to me to lack that, that sort of internal part that drives so much Western art.
Well, obviously, market has played an issue in that. In the recent years, with the advent of auctions, I think there's certain language that certain artists, but those that are conceptually have a conceptual rigor, who are in some ways exploring more intellectual art, marrying kind of intellectual sensibility or intellectual faculty with their work, they do exist. A lot of them take ideas from the 7th to the 13th century because obviously ideas don't fall out the sky. A lot of these have emerged from the Middle East, from the Islamic world and the Sephardic world, from ancient Spain as well. And how we understand them in the Western world is through continental philosophy, but they have an origin. And I think many of the artists are aware of this. Whether they choose to investigate it or not is at their decision.
And what about in Azerbaijan? You said that contemporary art's a bit new there, a decade or so. So what's actually happening apart from the piece that you showed us with the snake?
A very strong modernist tradition of painting, tradition of craft, of plastic art, sculpture, that was mainly under the unions, artist unions that the Soviets had installed. So the very rigorous program of art and art history, but then again it had a kind of Russified tone to it. But then there were tropes that they borrowed from Iran, having one of the most sophisticated art scenes in the world as well, and historically that they reinvented or kind of reappropriated within their practices. But then many of these artists went against that, because then after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they also wanted to reject the stagnancy of the Soviet system. Yes. It was a very strict and stagnant art scene that the Soviets had installed there. So contemporary artists are kind of grappling with that there. They're also very learned, very literate, very well-read, because the Soviets did install that.
But the cultural traditions of that part of the world, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, etc., and Turkestan, they're basically nomadic. Their great traditions are nomadic, so that it's about movement of people and their stock, etc. Is that still a kind of motivation in their art as well now?
Well, Central Asia is very different from Caucasus, or even very different from the Gulf or the Middle East as well. Yes. It has its own kind of history and very different as well. All these stands, they're very different. They're not to be lumped together. They have different linguistic and cultural traditions, even religious traditions as well. And so it's quite important to look at these countries individually, the way we were speaking about Asia earlier on, that it can't be lumped into this kind of one sum, that there are all these different elements and kind of ingredients to kind of look at.
And yet the movements of peoples there historically was constant.
Sure, but then again, even the way Islam spread, it was through migration. And that's how Islam came to Central Asia as well, through this kind of movement of people, through the Ottoman army or through the Persians and so forth. It kind of moved around. But they are traditionally nomadic people, that's correct, but maybe not in Azerbaijan. They're very proud of their heritage as well. But all of these stands have their own individual identity. And traditionally, they may have had a more nomadic kind of lifestyle, if you like, but now they have evolved. And there's something more deeper happening now. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they're going back to this idea of patriotism, going back to nationalism, rejecting Russian language, which is quite ironic given that 2 generations have grown up solely speaking Russian. And so they're now, for example, in Kazakhstan, they're trying to revert to speaking Kazakh language. But then, Kazakh language is somewhat redundant there when 2 generations only speak Russian. So now they're enforcing it in school, and similarly in Azerbaijan, the Azari language is being enforced. Or in Tajikistan, they're going back to the old form of Persian.
Sogdian also, wasn't it? A Sogdian language?
Dari, like an old Persian dialect, yes. That was in Tajikistan and also in Uzbekistan as well. But they all have their individual identities. Of course, Moscow does somewhat control them still. That's something that's not spoken about too much. But there are still connections. They're not going to be severed immediately. But when Soviet Union collapsed, these regions were left to their own devices. It kind of created this tribal mentality again, where many groups were vying for power against one another. And that also created a problem, a societal problem, disparities as well. There are strongholds in the governments in terms of some of them related.
But is there much control about these independent creative spirits?
Well, there are. They're mostly artist studios, which is very interesting. My practice as well largely revolves around artist-led initiatives, artist-led manifestos or artist-led ideas, particularly in this part of the world, Central Asia. Incidentally, artists are the most interesting, are the most astute and the most knowledgeable. Art historians are rather stale. So through artists, you learn more about art history and the movement than you actually do from the historians or the curators. So often the artist manifesto becomes very important.
We know that.
Yes, but they're so more because they're completely detached from what is actually happening. So although there isn't as developed infrastructure as there is here in the West, or in other parts of the regions that I've explored today, they do have the artist studios role, which is very significant, how there's a peer-driven society, how artists support one another. So the social studio is quite important.
And are is there a kind of market for their art as well? I mean, do these artists sort of have a degree of financial independence?
Which region do you essentially
in say, Azerbaijan?
Well, there is starting to become a market. Recently, obviously, the auction houses came there with their with bells and whistles on and everything to try to discover art from, Central Asia and its neighbours. But there is a scene; it's nascent.
It's like Rossi and Rossi has refound, contemporary art in Tibet.
Well, Rossi and Rossi are a good friend of mine, Fabio, and he actually, I actually worked with him for Art Hong Kong in a project with a Kazakh artist. He's very interesting, but obviously he looked at antiquities. What I'm interested in is that relationship between antiquity and modernity. Yeah. How that transition has occurred, and that is a lot of the artists are grappling with that as well. They're rediscovering that relationship.
Were we going to ask people if they wanted to? We were? And should we? Right. Okay. We can...
Hi there. I really enjoyed the talk, so thank you for that. So my name is Jay Gatienza. I'm a reporter for SBS Filipino. I was actually just wondering, because you've traveled to so many different countries and work with so many different artists who reside in different, who have different, ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, and I was just wondering, what can you say about the different visual languages that they spoke and how that's reflected in their art practice, and if you see that if there's a specific visual language that you encountered among those different people?
Well, there isn't one particular language. It's a multitude of languages, a plural term, visual cultures. But I have noticed kind of usage of more reappropriation of traditional crafts in Central Asia, exploring monumentality, looking at architecture, which seems to be very important there. Also looking at kind of anti-colonial examples of architecture or subverting ideas around monumentality, for example, especially monuments that were erected during the Soviet Union. So there was this whole situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union where all the sculptures of Lenin and Stalin were all ripped down and replacing them with Chinggis Khan, Timur Lang, and the kind of Mongol kind of heroes of that time. So it's kind of interesting trend to look at that, but also to look at this idea, which I'm exploring in my PhD, is this post-Soviet Orientalism, this interesting kind of third-degree Orientalism. We've gone through the kind of how the West perceives, because Central Asia or the former Soviet Union, the Asian side of it, was never really a kind of colonial history. It was more of an imperial history. So that is heavily explored within the artist practices there. Another issue is obviously redefining the contemporary Silk Road, which I've seen across both the Middle East and Central Asia and the Caucasus, redefining this through borders, through contemporary languages, particularly through the kind of portability, the language of portation, if you like, especially as we're entering this kind of draconian period. So that's important as well to kind of reflect upon. And this kind of deconstruction of many of these Western labels. Ironically, nobody from the Middle East ever says, by the way, I'm from the Middle East. They actually say I am Persian, or I'm from the Levant, or I'm from Maghreb, which is North Africa. No one will actually say that. So all this kind of deconstruction and looking at new forms of translation, transmission of ideas, that seems to be a very interesting kind of process of thinking through conceptually for many artists.
Down the front. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. And I also really enjoyed the challenging question that Edmund Capon asked, and to see the different... Did you use Rukni Harizada in one of your images that got flipped through quickly? Would you mind to talk about the project you worked and when was it, and the involvement a little bit, because we missed it. We just saw a very quick photo.
Rukni Harizada is an Iranian artist who lives and works in Dubai. He's an Iranian artist, he's a painter, and he often collaborates with his brother and their colleague Hisham back in the Guggenheim section. There. And Rukni is a painter, and incidentally the title of the show is also But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise. But it's taken from this, but it comes from Walter Benjamin. So it's a kind of reworking, second-hand reworking of that for the exhibition. And Rukni has produced a series of 24 paintings that look at the kind of viral rerun of the media. Every one of these paintings is painted on stills taken from YouTube or painted directly on top of newspaper. And in some of them you can actually see the watermark where something's printed off the internet. And he's replaced all human heads with animal heads. And this is quite akin to the Persian tradition of using fable, using animals as well to speak about societal issues. And it's very interesting that Rukni's practice looks at public gatherings. Either it's kind of maybe a public wedding or it might be an execution, but he often explores a kind of public notion. So commiseration and jubilation equally are explored within his work. The usage of animal heads is quite significant. And also if we think about, when I was curating this work, when I was thinking about it, writing about it, I kept on thinking about the use of YouTube. I kept on thinking, I was watching Julian Assange's trial on YouTube. I was thinking about how I'm actually watching philosophy and all these ideas on YouTube, because I don't watch television, so often catch up that way. And it became very interesting for me to look at surveillance, ideas around surveillance. And if we think about more within the Western kind of idiom, or literature in particular, think about the work of George Orwell, Animal Farm, how he was writing about it was a critique of Stalin's kind of draconian policies. So there's a lot of that within Rukni's work.
Can I just pick up on something you just said then about, a lot of the territories that you're working in now, where in recent times, recent centuries, the creative spirits have to some extent been subjugated quite strongly. And now you're talking about their exploring technology as a means. Are you suggesting that technology is a way of sort of liberating in those once contained imaginations, that technology is becoming a great aid to the exploration of individual imaginations in those parts of the world, your parts of the world?
I think for sure technology is playing the role. If we think about the Arab Spring and the People's Revolution in Egypt, people communicated through Facebook. It became, a meeting point, meet in Tahrir Square. Everybody was communicating through Twitter or Facebook until the Egyptian government switched it off. So there was a use of it for communication as a tool. And that is very interesting. Obviously, like in Iran, for example, I think Instagram is banned inside Iran. But although people still use it, like in China, it is also filtered. It's not just exclusive to this part of the world, but questions about civil liberties often do come up, and artists find ways to kind of grapple with that. Like I showed the work of Abbas Akavan, an Iranian artist who substitutes human form for plant form. So all those political struggles are there. However, artists are using and subverting languages, because nobody wants to create a didactic kind of. It's like writing in prose or writing in poetry. If you write in prose, you've just put everything down in black and white. But when you're writing in poetry, you have this ambiguous language.
Yes, you have to orchestrate it in a different way. But so the idea that technology is kind of an aid for many of the artists.
For some of them, but not all of them. Some of them are looking at other tropes as well. And not all of them are exclusively working with technology, but it seems to be a younger population. So they've grown up with the internet. They've grown up with all of this. I mean, I didn't get the internet till I was 16, 17 years old. And they are a young population who have grown up with it. So their approach to technology is very different from yours or mine.
Sorry.
I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but I've been following the work of a media professor from California who's written a lot about what he calls the convergence culture, which is all of these post-90s generations putting their ideas not just in one form, but across all the available technology. And for me, the question is encouraging artists to be as open to the use of technology in expressing their ideas. And I take from your paper, and thank you very much for it, that could be a liberating opportunity.
Of course, and also if we think about the way art is moving, it's like a cross-circulation of both meaning and origin and knowledge as well. And I kind of looked at that in my exhibition at the Guggenheim. It wasn't thematic. We didn't go room by room or section by section. It was all to do with this cross-circulation, cross-pollination. I think even if you think about the way the World Wide Web works, it's this entanglement, and which is very fascinating in artist practice, particularly this next younger generation.
Looking at your 17 artists in the storm blowing from paradise, did any of those in their works obviously just betray a sense of place, or was that completely transcended?
Well, there are elements of that. This was a collection-building exercise as well as a curatorial project.
Which was interesting. Yeah. All these are being acquired.
Whilst I was thinking about the exhibition, curating it, I was also thinking about works that would enter the permanent collection of the Guggenheim. So it was a double, kind of twofold mission. But there are examples. There are kind of, like if we think about Hassan Khan, this bank banister. Okay, on the one hand, it's inspired by the handrail of the first Egyptian state-owned bank, first Egyptian state-owned bank, Bank Misr, which is headquartered...
I'm not sure too many people would recognise that.
No, they wouldn't. They would look at the Frank Lloyd Wright banister that's directly behind it and say, is this part of the architecture? So that was kind of interesting, but it's also an object in its own right. It has a kind of Duchampian reading, but at the same time, it's to be looked at in its own entity as a kind of value system, if you like. There are a lot of critiques of value system in the show. This work by Susan Hafuna, that's on the left-hand side, called Buildings. She's an Egyptian artist, but these were all produced in New York, where she'd spend a series of days walking around the city, come back to her studio and just draw. So
it's sort of architectural souvenirs of her.
Yeah, kind of, if you like, but they also allude to the mashreba, or the kind of facades in the Arabic world that are on civic buildings or private homes that allow you to look out, but the public cannot look in. So there are ideas there explored. But it was important for me to also curate a show that didn't immediately give the aesthetic quality of the Middle East, because I've seen far too many shows like that give a very particular reading. I wanted to kind of dissect that. And often critics...
Yeah, but that sort of begs the question I asked originally about
Sure.
whether whether that aesthetic does still exist, or has it been eroded with all this transportation, this movement of peoples?
Well, there is that, but also curators. You know, there's a huge responsibility of a curator to articulate an artist's work. And they can either, you know, there have been several shows of the Middle East throughout the entire Western world, several in Europe, several in North America. Yet it was very important to kind of think of it thematically, to think of this idea of geometries, to kind of start from that point of origin, to kind of reflect upon this constructed region. So that it's also to do with a series of displays, the kind of site specificity, bringing Frank Lloyd Wright into this, his engagement in Iraq. There were other kind of questions. And
1950, was it?
1950s, yes. So there were all these other questions that were being explored here as well. So I wasn't going country by country saying, oh, two from Iran, one from here, one from there. It was more of a kind of philosophical question. And also works entering a collection that in some degree I want them to assimilate, yet I want them to also disturb the collection somehow. That's why public movement, the performance artists kind of cut through that.
Sorry.
Hello. Is that? Hello. Hi. I feel like before I ask my question, I kind of acknowledge the fact that the rubric you've been given by the institution seems to cover such an amazing diversity of, places and histories and stuff. But one thing that I was kind of struck by was the work by Wafa Bilal, which is the large pinhole camera, and just how there's there it is.
If you go...
Yeah, that one. I was kind of struck by that because there's obviously like this technological sublime that's being referenced there, and it's beyond something that's just sentimental. Like it kind of struck me just in light of certain things that have happened this year, like the death of Zaha Hadid, for example. Like her work quite obviously is an example of this technological sublime. And I've heard her speaking towards the end of her life about reminiscing about Iraq when she was young, and just how it was kind of a model of cosmopolitanism. Sorry, I'm trying to bring quite a few ideas into this kind of question, but basically you seem to like touch upon certain points in history where there was kind of this project to establish lake statehood in a lot of countries in the Arabian Peninsula, Central Asia. And this work to me kind of seemed quite emblematic of how perhaps that project has been taken up by people in the diaspora now, engaging with technology and with, I guess the Islamic contribution to technology. And the pool of talent that the diaspora provides to technological research in the West, for example. It kind of seems to me that has become kind of where that project in the mid-century that was disrupted is now taking place in a kind of dispersed kind of way. I could be wrong, I don't know, but it kind of seems to me like that is something that's kind of a part of the diasporic project. I don't know, I was just wondering if perhaps that's something that you would either agree with or have some thoughts on?
I think that's a very interesting question. So if I understand correctly, you're asking whether artists from the international diaspora who are related to these parts of the world, how they are kind of resurrecting some of these traditional ideas? Is that what you're asking?
Kind of, yeah, but kind of also... oh, thanks. Just kind of in a way reviving and continuing that mid-century project that was disrupted in a lot of places by war. The big power blocks, and once Turkey as a power block was kind of removed from that equation, it kind of seems to me in a dispersed way that's being kind of kept alive, almost, I don't know, in a hope of kind of bringing it back at some point or something, I don't know.
Well, there might be that. Maybe it's a personal question rather, though. I can't really speak about it in terms of a whole diaspora of artists, but there are ideas that are being resurrected, and there isn't that kind of problem with dealing with the past. It seems to be quite in the present because its implications are very much in the present. This is something why. And I think, like in the case of Turkey, I think a lot of what Erdogan is trying to do also relates to kind of like the father of modern Turkey under Ataturk, what Ataturk was trying to achieve. He's also trying to revive that. So there are kind of possibly nostalgic endeavors or for other kind of political reasons to kind of bring certain strategies at play. I think it's a much wider question, in terms of all the different schemas that are being discussed.
Yeah, I think I'm referring more specifically to countries where there was a project of establishing like a lake.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I think I was referring more to countries where there was this very specific project of establishing a lake kind of statehood. But yeah, no.
But it's a subjective kind of question. It could be a reference to some artists, but not necessarily all. I haven't necessarily kind of grappled with that yet. Thank you.
Got time for one more question if there's one more.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was very rich. You gave me a lot to think about. I just wanted to return to your title, I think Site of Specificity, and to ask you if you could clarify how you define specificity, because I'm hearing, and I'm asking coming from this place, one, I hear you saying, based on your curatorial practice, that you're responding to Edward Said's reminder of Orientalism and this idea that what we hear and see of the Middle East is often representation. And rather than asking artists to kind of provide a more authentic sense, your strategy seems to be proliferation and also thinking about, rather than asking what is the Middle East, you're asking who gets to represent and say what is the Middle East, right? And we're getting a huge array of that. And then second is that there's this piece of technology, which seems to me, and also because so many of your artists have these histories of migration, diaspora, multiple places as part of their practice, and that so much of this is also on technology and in relation to technology and on the internet. It strikes me as, when I look at the visuals, I cannot place it because it's everywhere and nowhere, and yet you say it's site of specificity. So what do you mean by specificity?
Well, I was playing with site specificity, with specificity of site. When I think about this, I often think of location. And you may have read The Location of Culture by Homi Bhabha and others of his kind of thinking that look at the concept of third space, how it's something that ruptures many of these ideas. And what is specific or what is specificity is something that I'm constantly trying to deconstruct. And so looking at third spaces or spaces that kind of function like conceptual corridors, if you like, are very important. And in terms of using technology or this is the kind of language that many people communicate through. It's through the social media, it's through Skype. I have had studio visits over Skype with artists who've showed me their entire studios, for example. So site becomes a very important issue, and that's also, if you think about the space of the museum, that's also the location and how we can kind of deconstruct that, how we can cut through that. So it has a kind of double meaning, if you like, and that was something that I was trying to play with through the project that I showcased today at the Guggenheim, but also other examples, how site is so important, because it's about that. I mentioned to you space, so we think about like ideas around space, they're not just physical, they're also mental. And that is to do with representation, how we spoke about Orientalism, but also how spaces are mapped or ideas are mapped even before the kind of physical and action takes place. Or ideas, how they take place within the mind, or the mapping of the mind, if you like, which is also a kind of form of geometry. So that it's quite a complex idea, which is often I refer back to that idea of this complex jigsaw. Thank you.
It's a pretty good note to end on, complex jigsaws. Just want to say thank you again to Sara, and thank you for Edmund for joining us for this really interesting chat.